The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trading post as Sarah Mitchell swept the wooden porch for the third time that day. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the broom handle, not from the cool desert air, but from the growing unease that had settled in her chest like a heavy stone. 3 weeks had passed since the last Apache raid on a nearby settlement, and the tension in the small frontier town of Copper Ridge had become thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah's father, Thomas Mitchell, emerged from inside the trading post, his weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed to deepen each passing day. He carried his rifle in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The Apache had been unusually quiet lately, which made everyone more nervous than if they had been actively raiding. "Sarah, get inside," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much violence in his 53 years on the frontier. "Mrs. Henderson just rode in from the Murphy farm. Says she saw smoke signals to the north." Sarah nodded and quickly gathered her skirts, but before she could step through the doorway, the sound of approaching horses caught their attention. A small group of settlers rode hard toward the trading post, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. Leading them was Jake Morrison, a young rancher whose property bordered the contested territory where Apache hunting parties often passed through. "Mitchell," Jake called out as he dismounted, his horse lathered with sweat. They took the Hendricks family, burned their cabin to the ground, and took Martha and little Tom, left old Ben dead in the yard. Sarah's blood ran cold at the news. Martha Hendricks was barely 22, married just last spring to Ben Hendricks, who had been trying to make a go of farming in the dangerous borderlands. Their son Tom was only 4 years old, with bright blue eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Thomas set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink against the wooden railing. "How long ago?" "Maybe 2 hours," Jake replied, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "We followed their trail for a while, but they split up into smaller groups. Looks like they're heading toward the mountains." From somewhere in the distance, the sound of an Apache war cry echoed across the desert, sending chills down Sarah's spine. She had heard that sound before 3 years ago when her mother had been killed during a raid on their previous homestead. The memory of that day still haunted her dreams. The image of her mother's gentle face twisted in fear as the Apache warriors descended upon their small cabin. "We need to form a search party," said another settler, an older man named Pete Garrison, whose own daughter had been taken by Apache raiders 5 years earlier and never returned. "Every hour we wait makes it harder to track them." Thomas shook his head grimly. "A search party of settlers won't stand a chance against Apache warriors on their own territory. We need the cavalry, but the nearest fort is 3 days' ride from here." Sarah watched the men discuss their limited options, feeling helpless and angry. She thought about Martha Hendricks, probably terrified and wondering if she would ever see civilization again. The Apache were known to adopt captives into their tribes, especially women and children. But the transition was often brutal and not everyone survived it. As the men continued their heated discussion about rescue attempts and military intervention, Sarah noticed movement on the ridge to the east. A lone figure sat motionless on horseback, silhouetted against the bright morning sky. Even from this distance, she could tell it was an Apache warrior by his posture, and the way he seemed to merge with his horse as if they were one creature. "Father," she whispered, tugging gently on Thomas's sleeve and pointing toward the ridge. The conversation among the men stopped abruptly as they all turned to look in the direction Sarah indicated. The Apache warrior remained perfectly still for several long moments, clearly observing the trading post and the gathered settlers. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he wheeled his horse around and disappeared behind the ridge. "That was Nalnish," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and respect. "I'd recognize that painted pony anywhere. He's one of their best scouts," Sarah had heard. The name Nalnish whispered in fearful tones around Copper Ridge. The Apache warrior was said to be young, but already legendary among his people for his skill with a bow and his ability to move through the desert like a ghost. Some claimed he could shoot an arrow through a silver dollar from 100 yards away. Others said he had never lost a single warrior under his command during raids. "If Nalnish is scouting our position," Thomas said grimly, "it means they're planning something bigger than just taking the Hendricks family. We need to get word to the other settlements and prepare for a possible attack." The men quickly organized themselves, some riding out to warn neighboring homesteads while others began preparing the trading post's defenses. Sarah helped her father move supplies and ammunition inside, but her mind kept wandering to Martha Hendricks and little Tom. She wondered if they were still alive, if they were being treated well, or if they were suffering somewhere in the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond the mountains. As the day wore on, more settlers arrived at the trading post seeking safety and information. Each new arrival brought fresh stories of Apache activity in the area. Some reported seeing large groups of warriors moving through the canyons, while others spoke of finding abandoned campsites with signs that suggested a major gathering was taking place somewhere in the traditional Apache strongholds. By evening, nearly 40 people had crowded into and around the trading post, families with small children huddled together, their faces etched with worry. The men took turns standing guard while the women prepared what might be their last hot meal for several days. Sarah moved among them, offering what comfort she could, but her own heart was heavy with dread. As darkness fell across the desert, the sound of Apache drums began echoing from the mountains, a rhythmic beating that seemed to match the fearful pounding of every settler's heart. 3 days passed before the Apache attack came, but when it did, it arrived like a thunderstorm breaking over the desert. Sarah woke to the sound of war cries and gunfire just before dawn, the peaceful quiet of the trading post shattered by the thunder of unshod hooves and the whistle of arrows cutting through the morning air. She rolled from her bedroll and crawled toward the window, keeping low as her father had taught her. Through the gaps in the wooden shutters, she could see Apache warriors on horseback circling the trading post like wolves around a wounded deer. Their faces were painted with red and black war paint, and feathers decorated their long black hair. They moved with deadly precision, each warrior knowing exactly where to position himself for maximum effect. "Stay down, Sarah," Thomas shouted from across the room as he fired his rifle through a gun port. The sharp crack of his weapon was answered immediately by the twang of bowstrings and the thud of arrows striking the wooden walls of the building. The siege lasted for 6 hours, with the Apache warriors maintaining constant pressure on the defenders, while never exposing themselves unnecessarily to rifle fire. Sarah watched in amazement and terror as they demonstrated tactics that army officers back east could never have imagined. They used the natural terrain to their advantage, appearing and disappearing behind rocks and scrub brush like desert spirits. Jake Morrison had taken a position near the front door, and Sarah could see blood seeping through his shirt where an arrow had grazed his shoulder. Mrs. Henderson clutched her 2 young daughters close to her chest, whispering prayers and trying to keep them calm despite the chaos erupting around them. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the dust kicked up by the horses and the acrid scent of fear sweat from the trapped settlers. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The Apache warriors pulled back beyond rifle range, but they didn't disappear entirely. They could be seen moving among the rocks and brush, clearly planning their next move. The silence that followed was almost worse than the battle itself, heavy with tension and the promise of more violence to come. "They're testing our defenses," Pete Garrison said grimly as he reloaded his rifle with shaking hands. "This was just the beginning." Thomas nodded, his face grim as he surveyed their situation. They had plenty of ammunition for now, but food and water would become problems if the siege continued much longer. More importantly, they all knew that the Apache could afford to wait while the settlers could not. During the lull, Sarah found herself thinking about the Apache warrior she had seen on the ridge 3 days earlier, Nalnish. She wondered if he was among the warriors surrounding them now, if he was the one planning this attack. The stories she had heard about him painted a picture of a man who was both fearsome and honorable, someone who followed the old Apache ways but also understood the changing world around him. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, a single Apache warrior rode slowly toward the trading post, carrying a long wooden staff with a white cloth tied to the end. He stopped just within shouting distance and called out in heavily accented English, "We want to talk. Send out your leader." Thomas looked around at the other men, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. Negotiating with Apache warriors was always dangerous, but ignoring their request might lead to a renewed attack that could overwhelm their defenses. "I'll go," Thomas said finally, checking his pistol and straightening his shoulders. "Father?" "No," Sarah whispered, grabbing his arm. It could be a trap. Thomas covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "Maybe, but we don't have many options left. If they wanted us dead, they could have killed us already. They're after something specific." Sarah watched through the window as her father walked slowly toward the Apache warrior, his hands visible and empty of weapons. The two men spoke for several minutes, their voices too low for her to hear the actual words. But she could see the tension in both their postures. When Thomas returned, his face was pale and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The other settlers gathered around him eagerly, desperate for any information about their situation. "They want 3 things," Thomas said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. "First, they want all our rifles and ammunition. Second, they want half our supplies and trade goods. And third," he paused, his eyes finding Sarah's face in the crowd, "they want Sarah." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt her knees go weak and she had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. She had known this moment might come eventually. Young women were valuable to Apache tribes, both as potential wives and as symbols of victory over their enemies. "Absolutely not," Jake Morrison said immediately, his voice sharp with anger. "We don't negotiate with savages." "Watch your tongue, boy," Pete Garrison said quietly. "These aren't savages. They're warriors fighting for their land and their way of life. But that doesn't mean we have to give them what they want." Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "What happens if we refuse?" Thomas looked at her with eyes full of pain. "They'll wait until nightfall and then attack in force. They have enough warriors to overrun us, and they know it. This is their way of offering us a chance to avoid unnecessary bloodshed." "And if we agree to their terms?" asked Mrs. Henderson, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll take what they want and leave. Everyone else goes free." Sarah felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her as she considered the impossible choice before her. She could condemn everyone in the trading post to death by refusing, or she could sacrifice herself to save them. She thought about her mother, who had died defending their home 3 years ago. She thought about Martha Hendricks and little Tom somewhere out there in Apache territory. "There has to be another way," Thomas said desperately. "I won't let them take my daughter." But even as he spoke, they all knew that their options were severely limited. The nearest help was days away, and the Apache warriors surrounding them showed no signs of impatience. They could afford to wait while the settlers could not. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She walked to the window and looked out at the Apache warriors positioned around the trading post. Somewhere among them was the leader who had made this demand, someone who held the power of life and death over everyone she cared about. "I need to see him," she said quietly. "See who?" her father asked. "Their leader, the one making these demands. If I'm going to make this choice, I want to look him in the eye first." The Apache warrior who rode toward the trading post in response to Sarah's request was not what she had expected. Nalnish sat tall on his painted pony, his long black hair adorned with eagle feathers that caught the late afternoon light. His face was strong and angular, marked with the traditional war paint of his people, but his eyes held an intelligence and depth that surprised her. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps only a few years older than her own 20 years. Sarah stepped out from behind the protection of the trading post walls, ignoring her father's urgent whispers for her to come back. She walked slowly toward the Apache leader, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The distance between them seemed to stretch forever, each step taking her further from the safety of her known world and closer to an uncertain fate. When they were close enough to speak without shouting, Nalnish raised his hand in a gesture for her to stop. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small space that separated them. Sarah found herself studying his face, searching for signs of cruelty or savagery, but instead she saw something that confused her even more. Respect. "You are brave to come out here," Nalnish said in English that was better than she had expected. His voice was deep and calm, without the harsh edge she had heard from other Apache warriors. "Your father fears for you." "My father fears for everyone," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You're asking him to choose between his daughter and his friends. That's not a choice any father should have to make." Nalnish nodded slowly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been regret in his dark eyes. "In war, there are no good choices. Only necessary ones. Is that what this is?" "War?" Sarah asked. "Or is it revenge for something we've done?" The Apache leader was quiet for a moment, his gaze shifting toward the mountains where his people made their homes. "Your people take our land, kill our buffalo, drive away the deer. You build your houses where our children once played. You make promises and then break them when it suits you. What would you call it? Sarah had no answer for that. She had heard the stories of broken treaties and betrayed trusts, of settlers and soldiers who treated Apache lives as worthless. She had also heard stories of Apache raids that left entire families dead, of children taken from their homes and never seen again. The cycle of violence and revenge seemed endless, with both sides claiming justification for their actions. What about Martha Hendricks and her son? Sarah asked. They never hurt anyone. They were just trying to make a life for themselves. And my sister was just trying to gather berries when your soldiers shot her, Nalnish replied, his voice hardening slightly. She was 15 years old. She died 3 days later calling for her mother. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her anger begin to mix with something else. Sympathy, understanding. This man wasn't a savage bent on random destruction. He was someone who had lost people he loved just as she had lost her mother. I'm sorry about your sister, Sarah said quietly, but taking me won't bring her back. No, Nalnish agreed. But it might prevent more sisters from dying. Sarah frowned, not understanding what he meant. How would taking me prevent more deaths? Nalnish studied her face for a moment before answering. You are the daughter of the most respected trader in this territory. Your father has influence with other settlers, with the soldiers at the fort. If you come with us willingly, it sends a message that some white people understand the cost of this war. It might open a path to talking instead of fighting. The idea that her capture could somehow lead to peace rather than more violence was something Sarah had never considered. She had assumed that Apache raiders took captives for the same reasons that made settlers fear them: cruelty, dominance, and revenge. And if I refuse, she asked, then we take what we need by force and more people die on both sides. The cycle continues. Sarah looked back toward the trading post where she could see her father watching anxiously through a gap in the shutters. She thought about all the families crowded inside. The children who had done nothing wrong except be born into a world where their presence was seen as a threat by the Apache people. What guarantee do I have that you'll keep your word? She asked. How do I know you won't take what you want and kill everyone anyway? Nalnish reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a small object, which he held out for her to see. It was a silver locket, obviously made by white craftsmen, with an intricate design etched into its surface. This belonged to my sister, he said quietly. A white woman gave it to her 2 summers ago, when my sister helped her find water after she became lost in the desert. The woman was pregnant and afraid, but my sister led her safely back to the trading post at Mesa Verde. The white woman gave her this locket as thanks. Sarah stared at the locket, surprised by the story. It was not the kind of tale she usually heard about interactions between Apache and settlers. My sister treasured this gift, Nalnish continued. She believed it proved that not all white people were enemies, that there could be understanding between our peoples. She wore it when the soldiers shot her. He closed his hand around the locket and looked directly into Sarah's eyes. I give you my word, spoken over my sister's memory, that if you come with us, your people will be safe. We will take only what we need to survive, and we will leave without harming anyone. Sarah found herself believing him, though she couldn't have explained why. There was something in his manner and the way he spoke of his sister that convinced her he was telling the truth. But believing him and agreeing to go with him were 2 very different things. What would happen to me? She asked. If I agreed to come with you? You would be treated with honor, Nalnish replied. You would become part of our people, learn our ways. In time, you might choose to stay, or you might choose to return to your own people when peace is made. The possibility of peace between Apache and settlers seemed impossibly distant to Sarah, but she found herself wanting to believe it could happen. She thought about Martha Hendricks again, wondering if the young mother had been given a similar choice or if she had simply been taken without any say in the matter. I need time to think, Sarah said finally. Nalnish nodded. The sun will set soon. Give me your answer then. As he turned his horse to ride away, Sarah called out to him. What about Martha Hendricks and her son? Where are they? The Apache leader paused and looked back at her. They are safe. The woman is strong and the boy adapts quickly. But they are not part of this negotiation. They were taken for different reasons. What reasons? Sarah asked. The same reasons your people take our children to your schools, Nalnish replied. To teach them a new way of living. With that cryptic answer, he rode away, leaving Sarah standing alone between two worlds, facing the most important decision of her life. Sarah walked back to the trading post in a daze, her mind spinning with everything Nalnish had told her. The faces that greeted her return were filled with anxiety and hope, everyone desperate to know what the Apache leader had said. Her father rushed to her side the moment she stepped through the door, his hands checking her over for any sign of harm. "What did he want?" Thomas asked urgently. "What did he say to you?" Sarah looked around at the crowd of settlers gathered in the small space, their eyes all focused on her expectantly. Children clung to their mothers' skirts and men held their rifles ready despite the temporary truce. These were good people, she realized, families trying to build new lives in a harsh land, just as the Apache were trying to preserve their ancient way of life in the face of unstoppable change. "He gave me until sunset to decide," Sarah said quietly. "If I go with them willingly, he promises that everyone here will be safe. They'll take some supplies and leave without hurting anyone." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Everyone understood what her decision would mean, both for her and for them. Mrs. Henderson was the first to speak, her voice trembling with emotion. "Child, you can't seriously be considering this. Those savages will—" She stopped herself, glancing around at the other faces in the room. "I mean, you don't know what they might do to you." "Actually," Pete Garrison said slowly, "I knew a woman who was taken by Apache raiders about 10 years ago. When she finally came back, she said they treated her well. Better than some white men treated their own wives, if truth be told." Jake Morrison scoffed at this. "You can't trust anything they say. They're heathens and killers. So are we when it suits us," Thomas said quietly, surprising everyone in the room. "I've seen what our cavalry does to Apache villages. I've seen the bodies of children killed because they happen to be born with the wrong color skin." Sarah looked at her father with new respect. She had never heard him speak this way before, never realized that he harbored doubts about the righteousness of the settlers' cause. "The point is," Thomas continued, "that good and evil aren't determined by the color of a person's skin or the language they speak. They're determined by the choices people make." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself pulled in different directions by the advice and opinions of the people around her. Some urged her to consider the sacrifice for the greater good, while others insisted that giving in to Apache demands would only encourage more raids and kidnappings. But as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Sarah realized that the decision was hers alone to make. No one else could weigh the factors that mattered most to her. No one else would have to live with the consequences of her choice. She walked outside to the porch of the trading post, where she could see the Apache warriors still positioned around their perimeter. They hadn't moved closer, but they hadn't withdrawn either. They were simply waiting, with the patience of people who understood that some decisions couldn't be rushed. Nalnish sat on his horse about 50 yards away, clearly visible but not threatening. Even from this distance, Sarah could feel his eyes on her, waiting for her answer. She thought about his sister, shot down while gathering berries. She thought about her own mother, killed during an Apache raid. She thought about Martha Hendricks and little Tom, somewhere out there adapting to a new life among people they had been taught to fear. The cycle of violence had to stop somewhere. Maybe it could stop with her. "Father," Sarah called, and Thomas immediately appeared at her side. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. Thomas's face went pale, but he nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." "I'm going with them," Sarah said, the words coming out more steadily than she felt. "But I have conditions." Before Thomas could respond, Sarah walked toward Nalnish, her father following close behind. The Apache leader dismounted when he saw her approaching, standing quietly as she covered the distance between them. "I'll come with you," Sarah said when she was close enough to speak normally. "But I want your word on 3 things." Nalnish nodded for her to continue. "First, I want to see Martha Hendricks and her son before I agree to anything. I want to know they're truly safe and well treated." "That can be arranged," Nalnish replied. "Second, I want regular communication with my father, a way to let him know I'm alive and well. If peace talks are really possible, we'll need a way to maintain contact." Nalnish considered this for a moment, then nodded. "This also can be arranged. And third," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger, "I want your promise that this arrangement will end if either side breaks faith. If your people harm settlers who aren't fighting against you, Or if my people attack Apache families who are trying to live in peace, then our agreement is finished." The Apache leader studied her face carefully, and Sarah had the feeling he was seeing her clearly for the first time. There was something new in his expression, something that might have been admiration. "You think like a leader," he said finally. "Your conditions are acceptable." Thomas stepped forward, his face etched with pain but also with pride. "Sarah, are you absolutely certain about this?" Sarah looked back at the trading post where faces filled every window, watching her make the choice that would determine their fate. Then she looked at Nalnish, this young Apache leader who was trying to find a path between war and peace. "I'm certain, Father. Someone has to try to build a bridge between our peoples. Maybe this is how it starts." Nalnish extended his hand toward her, not as a captor claiming his prize, but as one leader acknowledging another. "Come then. Your new life begins now." As Sarah took his hand, she heard a whispered voice from behind her. It was her father, speaking so quietly that only she could hear. "Don't let them take you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah turned to look at him one last time, seeing the love and fear and pride warring in his eyes. Then she looked back at Nalnish, who had heard her father's words and was watching to see how she would respond. The Apache leader's bow was strung across his back, and his hand rested casually near the quiver of arrows at his side. But there was no threat in his posture, only a quiet confidence that spoke of a man who knew his own strength and didn't need to prove it through violence. "She belongs to me now," Nalnish said simply, but his tone carried none of the possessiveness that his words might have suggested. Instead, it sounded almost like a promise of protection. Sarah felt something shift inside her as she heard those words. Not fear, as she might have expected, but a strange sense of possibility. Perhaps this was indeed the beginning of something new, something that could grow beyond the hatred and violence that had defined the relationship between their peoples for so long. As she walked toward Nalnish's horse, Sarah whispered her own promise to the desert wind. "I won't let them take me. I'm choosing to go." The Apache camp lay hidden in a canyon that Sarah never would have found on her own, even if she had been searching for it deliberately. The walls of red stone rose high on either side, creating natural protection from wind and enemies alike. Water trickled down from hidden springs, creating small pools that reflected the star-filled sky above. It was nothing like the barren wasteland she had imagined Apache territory to be. Sarah had ridden behind Nalnish on his painted pony for the better part of 3 hours, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance as they navigated narrow trails that seemed to exist only in the minds of the Apache warriors. The journey had been conducted in almost complete silence, with hand signals passing between the riders when communication was necessary. Now, as they descended into the hidden canyon, Sarah could see the glow of campfires and the shapes of traditional Apache dwellings called wickiups scattered throughout the protected space. The structures were dome-shaped and covered with grass and brush, blending so perfectly with the natural landscape that they seemed to have grown from the earth itself. "This is Siesta Canyon," Nalnish said, as he helped her down from the horse. "My people have used this place for many generations. The spirits here are friendly to us." Sarah looked around with wonder and apprehension. Apache men, women, and children emerged from their dwellings to watch the newcomers arrive. Their faces showed curiosity rather than hostility, but Sarah still felt very much like an outsider in their world. An elderly Apache woman approached them, her long gray hair braided with colored beads and her weathered face marked with traditional tattoos. She spoke rapidly to Nalnish in the Apache language, gesturing toward Sarah with obvious questions. "This is my grandmother, Desba," Nalnish explained to Sarah. "She wants to know if you come as a captive or as a guest." Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the elderly woman. "Tell her I come as someone who hopes to learn." Nalnish translated her words, and Desba's stern expression softened slightly. The old woman stepped closer to Sarah, studying her face intently. Then she reached out and touched Sarah's blonde hair, speaking again in Apache. "She says your hair holds sunlight," Nalnish translated. "She also says you have the eyes of someone who has seen sorrow. She will prepare a place for you." As Desba led Sarah away, Nalnish called after them. "Tomorrow you will see the woman and child you asked about. Tonight, rest and begin to learn our ways." The wickiup that Desba prepared for Sarah was small but surprisingly comfortable. The floor was covered with woven mats and soft animal skins, and a small fire burned in the center. the smoke escaping through an opening at the top. Sarah sat on one of the mats, still hardly believing where she was and what she had done. Desba returned with a bowl of stew and some kind of flat bread, setting them down in front of Sarah with gestures that needed no translation. The old woman then sat across from her, clearly intending to stay and observe her new guest. "Thank you," Sarah said, pointing to the food and then to herself. Desba smiled and repeated the gesture, then pointed to Sarah and said something in Apache. For the next hour, the two women engaged in a halting but meaningful conversation using gestures, simple drawings in the dirt, and the few Apache words that Desba taught her. Sarah learned that Desba had 7 grandchildren, that she was considered a skilled healer among her people, and that she had once helped deliver a white woman's baby during a rare peaceful encounter near a trading post. When it was time to sleep, Desba showed Sarah how to arrange the sleeping furs and demonstrated the proper way to tend the fire so it would last through the night. As the old woman prepared to leave, she paused at the entrance to the wiki-up and spoke one final sentence in careful English. "Bad spirits come to those who carry hate in their hearts. You have sadness but not hate. This is good." Sarah lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Apache camp. She could hear voices speaking in the musical language of the people, the sound of horses moving around in the makeshift corral, and the distant howl of coyotes calling to each other across the desert. It was a world completely different from anything she had ever known. Yet somehow it didn't feel entirely foreign. She thought about her father, probably sitting awake in the trading post wondering if he would ever see her again. She thought about the other settlers trying to rebuild their lives after the fear and uncertainty of the siege. Most of all, she thought about Nalnish and the choices that had brought them both to this moment. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of children playing outside her wiki-up. When she emerged, she found several young Apache children gathered nearby, clearly curious about the white woman who had arrived with their war leader. They scattered when they saw her, but their laughter could be heard from behind nearby rocks and bushes. Nalnish appeared as Sarah was attempting to braid her hair in the Apache style she had observed on some of the women. His own hair was unbound this morning, falling past his shoulders in waves that caught the early light. "Come," he said simply. "It is time for you to see your friends." They walked to another part of the canyon where Sarah saw a sight that both relieved and surprised her. Martha Hendricks sat in front of a wiki-up, weaving grass into a basket under the guidance of a young Apache woman. Little Tom was playing nearby with 2 Apache children of similar age, all 3 of them laughing as they chased a small dog around in circles. Martha looked up as Sarah and Nalnish approached, and her face broke into a smile of genuine joy. "Sarah, oh thank God you're all right. When they told me someone from Copper Ridge was coming, I hoped it might be you." Sarah rushed to embrace her friend, amazed at how healthy and unharmed Martha appeared.
"Are you truly well?"
"Have they treated you kindly?" "Better than I expected," Martha admitted, glancing at the Apache woman who had been teaching her to weave. "This is Ayana. She's been like a sister to me. And Tom," she looked toward her son, who was now being taught to use a small bow by one of the Apache boys. "He's learning their language faster than I am. Children adapt so quickly." Sarah watched little Tom for a moment, struck by how natural he seemed in this environment. The fear and trauma she had expected to see in both Martha and her son were simply not there. Instead, they both appeared to be thriving in ways that challenged everything she had been taught about Apache captivity. "But what about Ben?" Sarah asked gently, remembering Martha's husband who had been killed during the raid. Martha's face grew sad but not broken. "I grieve for him every day. But Ayana told me something that has helped me understand. She said that in Apache belief, the spirits of the dead watch over their loved ones and want them to continue living fully. Ben would want Tom and me to survive and find happiness, even if it's in a way he never expected." Nalnish, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward. "Your friend speaks truth. We do not take captives to cause suffering. We take them because our own numbers grow smaller each year. Children and women who can adapt become part of our strength." Sarah looked around the camp with new eyes, beginning to understand the complex reality of Apache survival. These were not savage kidnappers, but a people fighting extinction by incorporating those who could contribute to their community's future. Ayana approached and spoke to Nalnish in Apache, her tone suggesting she was asking a question. He nodded and turned back to Sarah. "Ayana wants to know if you would like to learn women's work alongside your friend." basket weaving, food preparation, the gathering of medicines. These skills will help you understand our ways. Sarah found herself nodding before she had fully considered the implications. Yes, I would like that very much. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Sarah with its normalcy. She spent her mornings learning practical skills from Ayanna and the other Apache women, discovering that their knowledge of desert survival was far more sophisticated than anything taught in the white settlements. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill, where to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, and how to preserve food for the harsh winter months ahead. In the afternoons, she often found herself in conversation with Nalnish, who seemed genuinely interested in her perspectives on the conflicts between their peoples. He spoke of his frustrations with younger warriors who wanted nothing but revenge, and of older leaders who refused to acknowledge that the world was changing around them. Some of my people believe that if we fight hard enough, we can drive all the white settlers away and return to the old ways, he told her one evening as they sat beside the small stream that ran through the canyon. But I have traveled beyond our traditional lands. I have seen the great cities of the white men, the endless numbers of your people. Fighting can only delay the inevitable changes, not prevent them. Then why do you continue to raid and fight? Sarah asked. Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. Because if we do not fight, we disappear entirely. If we fight too much, we also disappear. We must find the narrow path between these two deaths. Sarah began to understand that her presence in the camp was part of Nalnish's attempt to walk that narrow path. By treating her well and allowing her to learn their ways, he was demonstrating that Apache people could be reasonable and honorable. By maintaining communication with her father, through carefully planned meetings, he was keeping open the possibility of negotiation and peace. But the path was more dangerous than Sarah had initially realized. 3 weeks into her stay with the Apache, a group of young warriors returned from a scouting expedition with troubling news. A cavalry patrol had been tracking the Apache movements, and they were only a day's ride from the hidden canyon. They have a tracker with them, reported one of the scouts, a fierce-looking young man whose face was marked with fresh battle scars. A white man who knows our ways. They will find us soon. The mood in the camp shifted immediately from peaceful, routine to tense preparation for possible battle or flight. Weapons were checked, supplies were packed, and the women began preparing to move the children to an even more remote location if necessary. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of heated discussions about what to do with the white captives if the cavalry attacked. Some of the warriors argued that Martha, Tom, and Sarah should be used as hostages to negotiate safe passage. Others insisted that they should be released immediately to avoid giving the soldiers any excuse for violence. "What do you think should happen to us?" Sarah asked Nalnish during a brief moment when they were alone. He looked at her with eyes that held both regret and determination. "I think that the peaceful path we have been walking is about to become much more difficult to follow." That night, as Sarah lay in her wickiup listening to the sounds of preparation, around the camp she realized that the real test of everything she had learned and believed about the Apache people was about to begin. The arrival of the cavalry would force everyone to choose between the old patterns of violence and hatred, or the fragile new possibility of understanding that she and Nalnish had been trying to build together. "In the darkness," she whispered, a prayer to whatever spirits watched over this hidden canyon, asking for the wisdom to know what choice would serve the cause of peace rather than the demands of fear. The cavalry patrol arrived at dawn, their blue uniforms stark against the red canyon walls as they positioned themselves along the rim above the Apache camp. Sarah counted at least 30 soldiers, armed with rifles and led by a captain whose bearing suggested considerable experience fighting Apache warriors. Behind them rode the tracker the scouts had mentioned, a grizzled man in buckskins whose eyes constantly scanned the terrain below. Nalnish had positioned his warriors carefully throughout the canyon, using every natural advantage the terrain provided. Sarah could see rifle barrels glinting from behind rocks and scrub brush, but she knew the soldiers above would have difficulty spotting the Apache fighters until it was too late. The question was whether anyone wanted to start shooting, or if there was still a chance for words to prevent bloodshed. The cavalry captain raised a speaking trumpet to his lips, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This is Captain Morrison of the United States Army. We know you have white captives in that camp. Release them immediately and surrender, or we will take them by force." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as she recognized the name. This had to be Jake Morrison's father, the young rancher's military officer father who had been stationed at Fort Carson. The irony was bitter. Jake had been one of the settlers most eager for violence against the Apache, and now his father was here to potentially start the very war that Sarah had hoped to help prevent. Nalnish emerged from his position near the center of the camp, walking slowly toward a large boulder that would give him a clear line of sight to the soldiers above. His bow was strung and ready, but he carried it loosely at his side rather than in a threatening position. "I am Nalnish," he called back, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "The white women and child are safe. They are here by agreement, not as prisoners." "That's a lie," Captain Morrison shouted back. "Apache don't make agreements. They make war. Send up the captives now, or we're coming down to get them." Sarah looked around desperately, seeing Martha clutching little Tom close to her chest, while Ayanna and the other Apache women gathered the children into the safest areas of the camp. The warriors were tense and ready for battle, but she could see in their faces that they didn't want this fight any more than she did. Making a decision that surprised even herself, Sarah stepped out into the open area where both the soldiers and the Apache warriors could see her clearly. She raised her hands above her head and called out in the strongest voice she could manage. "Captain Morrison, this is Sarah Mitchell. I'm Thomas Mitchell's daughter from the Copper Ridge Trading Post." There was a moment of stunned silence from above, then the captain's voice returned, tinged with confusion. "Miss Mitchell? What are you doing down there? Are you hurt?" "I'm perfectly fine, Captain. I came here voluntarily to prevent bloodshed. These people have treated me and the other captives with honor and respect." Sarah could hear angry murmurs from some of the soldiers above, clearly not believing what they were hearing. The tracker beside Captain Morrison was speaking urgently in the officer's ear, probably advising him not to trust anything an Apache captive might say. "Miss Mitchell," the captain called again, "you may be suffering from some kind of shock or coercion. Come up here immediately and bring the other captives with you." "I'm not coming up there until you give me your word that there will be no violence," Sarah replied. "These people want to negotiate. They want to find a peaceful solution." Nalnish moved to stand beside Sarah, his presence both protective and supportive. "Tell your captain," he said quietly, "that I will speak with him alone. One soldier, one Apache warrior. No weapons. Let us see if men of honor can find a path that avoids unnecessary death." Sarah relayed Nalnish's proposal, but Captain Morrison's response was immediate and harsh. "I don't negotiate with savages. You have 5 minutes to send up those captives, or we're coming down with guns blazing." The word savages seemed to echo through the canyon like a physical blow. Sarah saw the effect it had on the Apache warriors, the way their grips tightened on their weapons and their faces hardened with anger. She also saw something else in Nalnish's expression. Disappointment, but not surprise. He had hoped for better, but he had expected exactly this response. "So be it," Nalnish said quietly so only Sarah could hear. "You tried to build a bridge, but they prefer the old ways of fire and blood." "Wait," Sarah said urgently. "There has to be another way. Let me talk to him. Let me try to make him understand." Nalnish looked at her with eyes that held both affection and sadness. "You still believe that words can change hearts that are closed by hate. This is a beautiful thing about you, but it is also a dangerous thing." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of rifle fire erupted from the canyon rim. Not aimed shots, but warning shots fired into the air. Captain Morrison's voice boomed down again, filled with military authority and growing impatience. "Time's up. We're coming down. Any Apache warrior who resists will be shot. Any white person who interferes will be considered a traitor." The threat of being labeled a traitor sent a chill through Sarah's heart. In the current climate of frontier justice, such an accusation could be as deadly as any Apache arrow. But she also realized that this moment represented the culmination of everything she had experienced since coming to the Apache camp. She could retreat into the safety of her white identity and watch as the cycle of violence continued, or she could stand firm in her conviction that there was a better way. Martha Hendricks appeared at Sarah's side, having left little Tom in Ayanna's care. Her face was pale but determined. "I stand with Sarah," she called up to the soldiers. These people saved my son's life and treated us both with kindness. I won't let you paint them all as monsters." The sight of two white women defending Apache. People seemed to enrage Captain Morrison beyond reason. "You've both been brainwashed by those heathens." Sergeant Williams, "Take 20 men and go down the south trail." Corporal Jensen, "Take 10 men down the north approach. We're going in hard and fast." As the soldiers began their descent into the canyon, Sarah felt Nalnish's hand on her shoulder. She turned to look at him, seeing a resolve in his eyes that both frightened and inspired her. "They have chosen their path," he said quietly. "Now we must choose ours. Will you stay with my people and face whatever comes? Or will you go to your own people and try to minimize the bloodshed from that side?" It was the question Sarah had been avoiding since the moment she first agreed to come to the Apache camp. Where did her loyalties truly lie? With the people who shared her blood and upbringing? Or with the people who had shown her a different way of seeing the world? As the first soldiers appeared on the canyon trails, their rifles glinting in the morning sun, Sarah made her choice. She reached for Nalnish's hand, intertwining her fingers with his in a gesture that would be clearly visible to the advancing cavalry. "I stay with you," she said simply. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Nalnish squeezed her hand gently, then released it to reach for his bow. "Then let my people see that not all white hearts are closed to understanding. And let your people see that some choices are worth dying for." The morning that had begun with hope for peace was about to become a test of everything Sarah believed about courage, loyalty, and the possibility of love transcending the barriers of race and culture. The battle that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed or imagined. The Apache warriors moved through their canyon home like shadows given deadly purpose, appearing and disappearing among the rocks with a skill that turned the soldiers' superior numbers into a liability. The narrow trails that the cavalry had used to descend into the canyon became traps that channeled them into carefully prepared ambush points. Sarah crouched behind a large boulder with Martha and little Tom, watching in awe and terror as Nalnish demonstrated why he was considered one of the finest warriors of his generation. His bow sang with deadly precision, each arrow finding its mark with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. But more than his skill with weapons, it was his leadership that impressed her most. He directed his warriors with hand signals and whistled commands, coordinating their movements so that the soldiers found themselves constantly outmaneuvered and confused. "How many men do you think they've lost?" Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of gunfire and shouting. Sarah shook her head, unwilling to count casualties on either side. Every soldier who fell was someone's son or husband, just as every Apache warrior represented a crucial part of a people already diminished by years of warfare. The tragedy was not just in the death and suffering, but in the terrible waste of it all. The tide of battle began to turn when Corporal Jensen led a flanking movement that brought his squad of soldiers dangerously close to where the Apache women and children had taken shelter. Sarah watched in horror as the young corporal raised his rifle toward Ayanna, who was shielding 2 small children with her body. Without thinking, Sarah broke from her own cover and ran toward the soldier, shouting at the top of her lungs, "Stop, don't shoot! They're not combatants!" Corporal Jensen spun toward her, his rifle swinging in her direction. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he might shoot her as well, but something in her appearance or voice made him hesitate. In that moment of hesitation, Nalnish appeared as if materialized from the rocks themselves. The Apache leader's bow was drawn and aimed at the corporal's chest, but he didn't release the arrow. Instead, he spoke in a voice that carried clearly despite the chaos around them. "Lower your weapon, soldier. The women and children are under my protection." Corporal Jensen's hands shook as he looked from Nalnish to Sarah to the Apache women behind them. He was young, probably no older than Sarah herself, and the reality of what he was being asked to do seemed to war with his conscience. "I have my orders," he said weakly. "Your orders are to rescue white captives," Sarah said, stepping closer to him despite the danger. "Well, here I am. I'm telling you that these people are not our enemies. The real enemy is the hatred and fear that brought us to this moment." The young soldier looked at her with confusion and something that might have been relief. "Miss, I don't understand. Are you saying you don't want to be rescued?" Before Sarah could answer, Captain Morrison's voice cut through the canyon air like a whip crack. "Jensen, what are you doing? Shoot that Apache and secure the captives." The corporal's face went pale as he realized he was caught between conflicting authorities. Sarah could see the anguish in his eyes as he struggled with an impossible choice. "Corporal," Nalnish said quietly, his bow still drawn but his voice surprisingly gentle. "A good soldier protects the innocent. Look around you. Who here threatens innocent life?" Jensen's gaze swept over the scene. Apache women shielding children, Martha Hendricks holding her son protectively, and Sarah standing between him and the people she had chosen to defend. Then he looked back toward where Captain Morrison's voice had come from, where the sounds of gunfire indicated continued fighting between soldiers and Apache warriors. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the young corporal lowered his rifle. "I can't do it," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't shoot people who aren't trying to hurt anyone." Captain Morrison's furious shout echoed through the canyon. "Jensen, follow your orders or face court-martial." But Corporal Jensen had made his choice. He looked at Sarah one more time, then turned and walked away from the conflict, leaving his rifle on the ground behind him. It was an act of military disobedience that would cost him his career, but Sarah could see in his face that he had chosen to save his soul instead. The gesture seemed to break something open in the canyon. Other soldiers began to hesitate, to question what they were doing and why. The Apache warriors, seeing that not all of their enemies were committed to violence, began to pull back from aggressive positions. Nalnish slowly relaxed his bow, though he kept the arrow nocked and ready. "Perhaps there is still hope for your people," he said to Sarah. "Perhaps there's hope for all of us," she replied. The fighting gradually died down as both sides began to recognize the futility of the situation. The soldiers had not succeeded in overwhelming the Apache positions, and the Apache had not driven off the cavalry. Instead, they had reached a bloody stalemate that benefited no one. It was Thomas Mitchell who finally broke the deadlock. Sarah's father appeared at the canyon rim, accompanied by several other settlers from Copper Ridge. His voice carried the authority of a man respected by both communities. "Captain Morrison," Thomas called down. "I'm here to speak for my daughter and the other civilians. I want to hear from them directly before any more blood is shed." Captain Morrison, his uniform torn and dirty from the fighting, looked up at the settler with obvious frustration. "Mr. Mitchell, your daughter appears to have been compromised by her captivity. She's defending the very savages who kidnapped her." "Let me be the judge of that," Thomas replied firmly. "Sarah, are you free to speak your mind?" Sarah stepped forward, Nalnish beside her, and looked up at her father. "I'm free, Father. Freer than I've ever been. These people have shown me that there's another way to live, another way to solve our problems." The words that followed would be remembered and retold for generations. As Sarah Mitchell stood in that hidden canyon and delivered a speech that challenged everything the frontier communities believed about themselves and their enemies. "We came to this land seeking freedom and opportunity," she called out, her voice carrying to every soldier and settler who could hear. "But we brought our fears and prejudices with us. We've been so afraid of losing what we have that we've forgotten what we came here to find." She gestured toward Nalnish, and the Apache people gathered around her. "These people have lived on this land for countless generations. They understand things about survival and community that we're only beginning to learn. Instead of trying to destroy them, we should be trying to learn from them." Captain Morrison shouted back angrily, "Those savages have killed good Christian people. They've raided our settlements and stolen our property, and we've done the same to them." Sarah replied without hesitation. "We've broken every treaty we've made. We've killed their women and children. We've driven them from their ancestral homes. When does the cycle of revenge end?" The canyon fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the rocks. Both sides seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Thomas Mitchell's voice broke the silence. "Sarah, what are you proposing? What do you want us to do?" Sarah looked at Nalnish, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked back up at her father and spoke the words that would change everything. "I'm proposing that we start over," she said. "I'm proposing that we sit down together, Apache and settler, and find a way to share this land instead of fighting over it. I'm proposing that we choose understanding over fear." She paused, then added the words that would seal her fate and perhaps the fate of both communities. "And I'm proposing to stay here and be part of that solution. This is my choice, freely made. Don't let them take me from the path I've chosen." As her words echoed off the canyon walls, Nalnish stepped closer to her side. His bow remained ready, but his other hand reached out to gently touch her arm. "She belongs to me now," he said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the silence. Not as a captive, but as a partner in building something new. The sun had reached its zenith above the canyon, casting sharp shadows that divided the space into areas of light and darkness. It seemed fitting, Sarah thought, for this moment, when their two worlds were being forced to choose between the darkness of continued conflict and the light of a new possibility. Whatever happened next would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who called this harsh and beautiful land their home.